Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of North Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. In the spring of 1838, across the tobacco fields of the Piedmont region, plantation owners began reporting an inexplicable phenomenon. A German shepherd, trained to track runaways, had seemingly turned against its purpose, leading enslaved people northward toward freedom. The animal belonged to Jebediah Thornton, a slave catcher whose reputation extended across Caswell, Person, and Granville counties. By the time authorities uncovered what had transpired, 14 souls had vanished into the night, and the Hound lay dead with a bullet in its skull. Thornton had acquired the remarkable animal in the autumn of 1836, and within months, his success rate in retrieving runaways had become the subject of both admiration and quiet unease among the plantation-owning class who employed his services. His methods were methodical and relentless, combining an intimate knowledge of the region's waterways, hidden paths, and natural shelters with the dog's seemingly supernatural ability to follow trails days old through rain and across rivers. Thornton frequently boasted in taverns and at county gatherings that the German shepherd possessed an intelligence that surpassed any hound he had ever known, claiming the animal could anticipate the movements of fugitives with uncanny precision. A journal entry dated March 15, 1838, written by plantation owner Edmund Yancey and discovered among family papers during an estate sale in 1971, provides a peculiar glimpse into Thornton's relationship with the animal. Yancey wrote that he had observed Thornton speaking to the dog as one would address another person, not with commands, but with what appeared to be consultation, as though seeking the animal's opinion on matters of direction and strategy, a behavior Yancey found both curious and unsettling in equal measure. The first incident that would eventually unravel the carefully constructed facade of Jebediah Thornton's operations occurred on the night of April 3, 1838, when two enslaved individuals, a man named Isaiah and a woman named Patience, disappeared from the Morrison plantation located along the Dan River in Caswell County. Charles Morrison, the plantation owner, immediately dispatched his overseer to summon Thornton, whose farm lay approximately 8 miles to the northeast, and by dawn on April 4th, Thornton arrived with the German shepherd, examining the ground near the slave quarters with his characteristic thoroughness before setting off in pursuit. Multiple witnesses, including Morrison's house servants and several field hands, later reported seeing Thornton depart, heading northwest, with the dog straining against its lead, nose to the ground, apparently following a clear trail that led toward the Virginia border. 3 days passed without word, an unusual length of time for Thornton, who typically returned successful within 48 hours, and when he finally appeared at the Morrison plantation on the evening of April 7th, he came alone, his clothes muddied, and his face bearing an expression that the overseer would later describe as troubled. Thornton reported that the trail had led him to the Roanoke River, where he claimed the fugitives had entered the water and the dog had lost the scent on the opposite bank, a plausible explanation given the river's strong current and width at that particular crossing point. A letter discovered in 1923 among the personal papers of Morrison's overseer, Benjamin Coulter, and preserved in the North Carolina State Archives, reveals the depth of suspicion that Thornton's failure generated. Coulter wrote to his brother in Virginia that Thornton had never once failed in 5 years of service, and that something about his demeanor upon returning suggested not frustration, but rather a carefully maintained composure that seemed rehearsed, as though he were performing the role of a defeated tracker rather than genuinely experiencing such defeat. Over the course of the following 6 weeks, a pattern emerged that would have been immediately recognizable had the plantation owners been communicating more freely with one another. But pride and competition among the wealthy landholding class often prevented such candid exchanges of information. On April 15th, 3 enslaved individuals vanished from the Whitaker plantation in Person County, and Thornton was summoned, returning 5 days later with an account of trails that divided and reconverged in a manner suggesting the fugitives had received assistance from someone familiar with confusing tracking dogs. On April 28th, 2 more disappeared from the Graves estate in Granville County, and again Thornton pursued them, reporting upon his return that heavy rains had washed away all traces of their passage beyond the first 10 miles. The pattern continued with a single escape from the Dalton plantation on May 6th, where Thornton claimed the fugitive had employed the old technique of walking backwards in his own footprints before disappearing into a creek, and then again on May 19th, when 4 individuals from the Patterson plantation vanished, leading to Thornton's most elaborate explanation, yet involving a sophisticated network of false trails and deliberate misdirection that suggested coordination beyond what enslaved people were believed capable of planning. A diary entry dated May 22, 1838, written by merchant Lucas Pemberton and discovered in a Historical Society collection in 1958, provides insight into rumors that were circulating through channels invisible to most white residents. Pemberton noted that his shop assistant, a free black man named Thomas, had mentioned hearing whispers among the enslaved community about a miraculous dog that led people to freedom rather than back to bondage. A story Pemberton recorded with obvious amusement, dismissing it as the kind of magical thinking and superstition he believed characterized the enslaved population's worldview. The white community, when such rumors reached their ears at all, treated them with similar contempt, unable to conceive that any animal trained for one purpose could serve its opposite. Martha Cavanaugh, a widow of 43 years, who had managed her late husband's 400-acre tobacco plantation with quiet competence since his death from typhoid fever in 1835, occupied a property that shared a border of nearly 2 miles with Jebediah Thornton's modest farm, along a dense stretch of pine and hickory forest that provided natural screening between the 2 holdings. Her personal correspondence, discovered in 1967 among a collection of documents donated to the Historical Society of North Carolina by her great-granddaughter, reveals observations that she committed to paper but shared with no living soul during the spring of 1838. In a letter to her deceased husband, a practice she had maintained in a private journal as a means of processing her thoughts, dated May 24, 1838. Martha described witnessing Thornton and his German shepherd moving through the woods near the property line at an hour well past midnight, the moon providing sufficient light for her to observe their movements from her bedroom window, which overlooked that particular section of forest. What struck her as profoundly unusual, she wrote, was that the dog appeared to be leading Thornton rather than following at his heel or ranging ahead on a scent trail, moving with clear purpose and direction, while Thornton followed behind, frequently glancing over his shoulder, as though concerned about being observed. She noted in subsequent entries dated May 30th and June 4th that she had witnessed similar nocturnal movements, always during the dark phase of the moon, and that on one occasion she observed Thornton carrying what appeared to be a heavy sack over his shoulder, though she could not discern its contents from such distance. Martha confided to her journal that she strongly suspected Thornton was engaged in some clandestine activity that violated either law or social convention, but she refrained from sharing these observations with neighbors or authorities, writing that a widow's testimony about the suspicious behavior of a man would be dismissed as either nervous imagination or malicious gossip, and she had no desire to expose herself to the ridicule that would inevitably follow such accusations without concrete proof. Jebediah Thornton's property stood in stark contrast to the sprawling plantations that dominated the Piedmont landscape, consisting of merely 60 acres of land with a modest single-story farmhouse constructed of hewn logs and chinked with clay, a small barn that had seen better days with its sagging roofline and weathered boards, and fields that produced tobacco and corn in quantities sufficient only for personal use and limited sale at local markets. The most peculiar aspect of Thornton's operation, one that marked him as an anomaly among his peers and generated quiet speculation in the community, was his complete absence of enslaved labor, a circumstance highly unusual for any white landowner in the region who possessed even modest means, particularly one whose profession, ironically, involved the pursuit and capture of those seeking to escape such bondage. Thornton worked his land alone, or occasionally hired poor white laborers for seasonal tasks, living a life of relative isolation that many attributed to his difficult temperament and the unsavory nature of his slave-catching profession. Archaeological excavations conducted in 1989 by a team from the University of North Carolina, investigating the site after the property had passed through multiple owners and fallen into disuse, uncovered evidence that fundamentally recontextualized everything that was known about Thornton's activities. Beneath the remains of the barn, whose structure had collapsed decades earlier, researchers discovered a hidden root cellar that had been deliberately concealed under a false floor, the underground chamber measuring approximately 12 feet in length, 8 feet in width, and tall enough for an adult to stand upright, with ventilation shafts carefully disguised to appear as natural gaps in the barn's foundation. The excavation yielded fragments of woolen quilts, ceramic food containers, tin cups, and the remnants of candles, all of which were carbon dated to the 1830s, and the sheer size of the space, combined with the quantity of artifacts, suggested it had been used to shelter multiple individuals simultaneously for extended periods, a discovery that prompted researchers to search historical records for any mention of Thornton's possible involvement in activities that would require such clandestine accommodations. A bill of sale discovered in 1978 among dusty county records stored in the basement of the Caswell County Courthouse, misfiled in a ledger containing property transactions from 1836, revealed information that fundamentally contradicted the story Thornton had told his neighbors about the German Shepherd's origins. The document, dated October 12, 1836, recorded the purchase of one male German Shepherd dog, approximately 2 years of age, from Klaus Zimmermann, a farmer residing in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, for the sum of $40, an extraordinarily high price for a working dog in that era, when most hounds could be purchased for $5 to $10 at most. Thornton had consistently told acquaintances in North Carolina that he had acquired the animal from a breeder in Virginia who specialized in tracking dogs, a lie that presumably served to avoid questions about why a North Carolina slave catcher would travel to Pennsylvania to purchase an animal for his profession. Research into Pennsylvania historical records conducted in the 1980s revealed that Klaus Zimmermann was well documented as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, his farm serving as a station where fugitives from southern states were sheltered and provided with provisions before continuing their journey northward toward Canada. Even more revealing was a letter discovered in 2001 among papers held by Zimmermann's descendants in Pennsylvania, dated March 8, 1837, written in Zimmermann's hand and addressed to Thornton in North Carolina. The letter, carefully worded to avoid explicit incrimination should it be intercepted, made reference to their shared understanding regarding the animal's purpose, and expressed Zimmermann's hope that the dog's special training would serve the cause they both held dear, mentioning specifically that the animal had been taught to respond to commands in German that would be unintelligible to most Americans, and that its true capabilities would only be apparent to those who understood its actual purpose, a purpose that Zimmerman trusted Thornton would honor, despite the considerable risk such activities entailed in a state where assisting runaway slaves carried severe legal penalties. The logbook of Samuel Garrett, proprietor of the Red Hawk Tavern in Yanceyville, preserved through generations in a private family collection, and eventually donated to the Person County Museum in 1993, provides a meticulous record of transactions that revealed patterns in Thornton's behavior that should have raised immediate alarm among the community had anyone been paying sufficient attention. Garrett's entries from the spring of 1838 document that Thornton appeared at the tavern on at least 9 occasions between April and June, always arriving well after dark and purchasing quantities of provisions that seemed excessive for a single man and his dog, including salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, hardtack, and on several occasions, medical supplies such as bandages and tinctures typically used to treat injuries or illness. The logbook noted specific amounts, with entries such as J. Thornton, 10 pounds salt pork, 5 pounds cornmeal, April 16th, paid in coin, quantities that would feed multiple people for several days and far exceeded what would be necessary for a man embarking on a typical tracking expedition lasting 2 or 3 days at most. Even more suspicious, though never officially investigated, were observations recorded not in Garrett's logbook, but in personal letters written by residents of the town and surrounding area, several of which surfaced during various historical research projects in the late 20th century. A letter written by merchant Abraham Foster to his cousin in Virginia, dated May 20, 1838, mentioned that Thornton had been seen leaving Yanceyville heading south toward the county line on at least 3 occasions, ostensibly departing to track fugitives or conduct business, yet on each instance had later been spotted by different witnesses traveling north on roads that led toward the Virginia border, a contradiction that Foster noted with puzzlement, but not outright accusation. No one confronted Thornton directly about these inconsistencies, partly because his reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable man discouraged casual inquiry, but also because voicing such suspicions would require acknowledging the unthinkable possibility that a white man, a professional slave catcher no less, might be actively betraying his own race and class. Reverend Samuel Blackwell served as the minister of Providence Baptist Church in Caswell County from 1832 until his death in 1851, a man known throughout the region for his scholarly disposition and his habit of maintaining extraordinarily detailed records of births, deaths, marriages, and the various spiritual struggles of his congregation, journals that he kept locked in a wooden chest in the church vestry, and which were believed lost when the church underwent structural repairs following a fire in 1889. However, during extensive renovations in 1954, workers discovered a metal strongbox concealed within a hollow space in the church's foundation, containing several leather-bound journals written in Blackwell's precise hand, documents that provided invaluable insight into the religious and social life of the community during the antebellum period. Among the entries spanning nearly 2 decades of ministry, one particular passage dated May 28, 1838, stood out for its cryptic nature and obvious emotional weight. Blackwell recorded that Jebediah Thornton had come to the church late in the evening, requesting private counsel regarding a matter of conscience that he could not share with any other living person, and though Blackwell did not record the specific details of their conversation, presumably to protect the confidentiality of pastoral communication, he wrote that the burden Thornton carried was profound and spoke to fundamental questions about the nature of law, morality, and Christian duty. The Reverend noted that he had advised Thornton using words that would later seem extraordinarily bold, stating that some sins, though condemned by human law and social convention, were holier in the eyes of God than the strict observance of immoral statutes, and he concluded the entry with a prayer that divine protection would shield Thornton from the wrath of men who could not comprehend such moral complexity. What makes this entry even more intriguing is that the following 3 pages had been deliberately torn from the journal, the ragged edges suggesting forceful removal, leaving historians to wonder whether Blackwell himself removed them out of fear, or whether someone else discovered the journal and excised information too dangerous to preserve. A comprehensive analysis of plantation records conducted in 2003 by historian Dr. Rebecca Ashford at Duke University revealed patterns in the spring 1838 escapes that would have been impossible for contemporary observers to recognize without access to documents scattered across 3 counties and multiple private collections. Ashford's research, which involved cross-referencing plantation journals, county census records, and astronomical tables, demonstrated conclusively that every single disappearance occurred during the new moon phase, when darkness would be at its maximum and the risk of visual detection at its lowest, a coordination that suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate planning by someone with knowledge of lunar cycles and their practical applications for clandestine movement. Furthermore, when Ashford plotted the locations of the affected plantations on a period map of the region, the properties formed a clear corridor running from south to north, beginning with the Morrison plantation near the Dan River and progressing northward through increasingly isolated rural areas toward the Virginia border, each plantation positioned approximately 10 to 15 miles from the next, a distance that could be covered on foot in a single night by individuals traveling with urgency and purpose. The pattern suggested not random opportunistic escapes, but rather a systematic operation that moved methodically through the region, targeting specific plantations in sequence, possibly based on intelligence about security measures, overseer schedules, or the physical geography surrounding each property that might facilitate escape routes. The final escape that would ultimately expose the entire operation occurred on the night of June 12, 1838, when 6 enslaved individuals, 3 men and 3 women ranging in age from 19 to 34, vanished from the Whitfield plantation in northern Caswell County, the property situated less than 8 miles from the Virginia state line. Augustus Whitfield, the plantation owner, discovered their absence at dawn on June 13th, when the field hands failed to appear for morning assembly, and the fury this particular escape generated, coming as it did after weeks of similar incidents throughout the region, would set in motion events that would prove catastrophic for all involved. The accumulation of failures, each accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations that strained credibility, finally exhausted the patience of the plantation-owning class, who had initially trusted Thornton's expertise without question. On June 14, 1838, a meeting was convened at the Caswell County Courthouse in Yanceyville, attended by Augustus Whitfield, Charles Morrison, Benjamin Graves, and 7 other plantation owners who had suffered losses during the preceding weeks, men whose combined wealth and political influence dominated the region's economy and social structure. The consensus reached during this meeting, as documented in a letter written by Morrison to his brother in South Carolina and discovered in 1969, was that Thornton's repeated failures represented either spectacular incompetence that contradicted his established reputation or something far more sinister that no one wished to articulate directly. The plantation owners agreed to form their own search party, pooling resources to hire additional trackers and offering substantial rewards for information, effectively bypassing Thornton despite his professional standing in such matters. A newspaper clipping from the Hillsborough Recorder dated June 15, 1838, and preserved in the North Carolina State Archives, announced a reward of $500 for information leading to the recovery of the 6 individuals who had escaped from the Whitfield plantation, an extraordinary sum that reflected both the desperation of the plantation owners and the financial losses they had collectively sustained through the disappearance of human beings they considered valuable property. The article, written in the formal style typical of period journalism, noted that the recent wave of successful escapes represented an unprecedented challenge to the institution that undergirded the region's prosperity, and made specific mention of Jebediah Thornton, stating that, despite his long-standing reputation as the most capable slave catcher in 3 counties, his curious lack of success in recent weeks had become a subject of considerable discussion and growing suspicion among those who employed such services. The public nature of this printed accusation represented a dramatic escalation, transforming private doubts into community knowledge and effectively challenging Thornton to either demonstrate his competence or face the consequences of failure that might extend beyond mere loss of business. A legal deposition given by Calvin Whitfield, younger brother of Augustus Whitfield, and a man who had accompanied his brother on numerous business dealings, was recorded on March 3, 1839, during proceedings related to the settlement of Thornton's estate, and this document, preserved in the Caswell County Court archives, provides the most detailed account of the confrontation that occurred on the afternoon of June 16, 1838. Whitfield testified that he and 4 other men, all representatives of plantation owners who had suffered losses, arrived at Thornton's property without prior notice, finding him working near his barn with the German shepherd resting in the shade nearby, and that when they accused him directly of sabotaging their tracking efforts through deliberate incompetence or worse, Thornton denied any wrongdoing with a calmness that Whitfield found unnatural given the gravity of the accusations being leveled against him. What struck Whitfield as particularly suspicious, he stated in his deposition, was that despite the fact no rain had fallen in the region for nearly a week, and the ground throughout the property was dry and dusty, the German shepherd's paws were caked with fresh mud of the type found near riverbanks or in low-lying wetlands, suggesting recent travel to locations far from Thornton's farm. When Whitfield pointed out this inconsistency and demanded an explanation, Thornton reportedly remained silent for a long moment, before stating that some debts cannot be repaid with money, only with conscience, a cryptic response that Whitfield interpreted as either an admission of guilt or the ravings of a man whose mind had become unbalanced. The posse proceeded to search Thornton's property thoroughly, examining the house, the barn, the fields, and the surrounding woodlands, looking for any evidence of concealment or proof that Thornton had been harboring fugitives. But they discovered nothing incriminating, no hidden compartments, no signs of recent occupation by multiple people, no supplies beyond what would be reasonable for a single man, a failure that only deepened their suspicions while providing no actionable evidence upon which to base formal charges. Frustrated by their inability to find concrete evidence during the search of Thornton's property, yet convinced of his involvement in the escapes, the plantation owners gathered again on the evening of June 17th and formulated a plan that represented their final attempt to expose what they believed to be Thornton's treachery. The strategy, as outlined in a letter written by Benjamin Graves to his cousin and discovered in a private collection in 1987, involved positioning watchers near Thornton's property who would maintain surveillance day and night, waiting for the next escape to occur, at which point they would follow Thornton rather than hire him, observing his movements to determine whether he was indeed assisting fugitives rather than pursuing them. The opportunity presented itself sooner than expected when, on the night of June 20th, two enslaved individuals, a married couple named Jacob and Esther, disappeared from the Dalton plantation, located approximately 12 miles southeast of Thornton's farm. Horace Dalton, the plantation owner, immediately sent word to the other members of the informal coalition, and true to their plan, they did not summon Thornton, but instead took up positions in the woods surrounding his property, waiting to see whether he would act independently. A sworn statement given by Henry Cartwright, one of the men who participated in the surveillance, documented in county court records from 1839, described what the watchers observed just after midnight on June 21st. Cartwright testified that Thornton emerged from his house fully dressed despite the late hour, carrying a pack over his shoulder, and accompanied by the German Shepherd, which immediately set off toward the northeast without any apparent command, moving with clear purpose and direction as though following a predetermined route. The posse, consisting of 6 armed men on horseback, maintaining a distance of approximately 200 yards, followed Thornton and the dog through dense forest, observing that the animal consistently traveled ahead of Thornton, pausing occasionally, as if waiting for him to catch up, the inverse of the normal relationship between tracker and tracking dog, a sight that confirmed their darkest suspicions about the true nature of the operation they were witnessing. The posse followed Thornton and the German Shepherd through 12 miles of increasingly rugged terrain, moving from cultivated fields into dense forest, then through bottomlands near creek beds, where the humidity hung thick even in the darkness, finally ascending into rolling hills covered with pine and oak that stretched toward the Virginia border. Multiple witness statements collected during the subsequent investigation, preserved in court documents from 1839, provide remarkably consistent accounts of what the men observed during those tense hours of pursuit, descriptions that would later become central to understanding the full scope of Thornton's activities. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, the dog led Thornton to a small clearing surrounded by thick undergrowth, a natural depression in the landscape that would be invisible to anyone not specifically seeking it, and there the posse observed 2 figures emerge from concealment, the escaped couple, Jacob and Esther, who had been waiting in that precise location. What shocked the watching men most profoundly, according to Cartwright's testimony, was the manner in which the German Shepherd greeted the 2 fugitives, not with the aggressive posturing of a hunting animal confronting its quarry, but with the excited friendliness of a dog reuniting with familiar companions, its tail wagging as it moved between them, accepting their touches with obvious pleasure. The posse watched from their hidden positions as Thornton removed his pack and distributed its contents, food and what appeared to be a map or written directions that he showed to the couple while pointing northward, his gestures suggesting he was providing specific instructions for the next stage of their journey. After perhaps 20 minutes of this consultation, Thornton embraced both individuals briefly, a gesture that violated every social and legal boundary of the era, then turned to head back south, while the German Shepherd, rather than following its master, began leading Jacob and Esther northward through the forest, the 3 figures moving with coordinated purpose into the darkness, leaving Thornton standing alone in the clearing for a long moment before he began his return journey, unaware that his every action had been witnessed by men who would ensure he never completed another such mission. The posse emerged from their concealment with weapons drawn, and what followed in the next few minutes was documented in court records filed in Caswell County in late June 1838, testimony compiled from multiple witnesses whose accounts varied in minor details, but agreed on the essential sequence of events that would end with blood soaking into the forest soil. According to depositions given by all 6 members of the posse, Thornton's initial reaction upon seeing the armed men was to turn and attempt to flee northward, presumably hoping to warn Jacob and Esther, or perhaps simply acting on the instinct of self-preservation that overwhelms reason in moments of mortal danger. The German Shepherd, which had been leading the escaped couple approximately 50 yards ahead, apparently sensed the sudden tension and threat, and witnesses reported that the animal stopped immediately, turned back toward the commotion, and began running at full speed toward Thornton, covering the distance in seconds with the powerful gait characteristic of its breed. What happened next was described by Cartwright as both horrifying and strangely noble. The dog positioning itself directly between Thornton and the approaching men, hackles raised, teeth bared, a low growl emanating from its chest as it adopted a protective stance that made its intentions unmistakably clear. Horace Dalton, whose plantation had been the most recent to suffer losses and whose rage had been building throughout the night of surveillance, raised his rifle and fired without warning or hesitation, the shot echoing through the forest and finding its mark in the center of the dog's chest. The animal collapsed instantly, dead before its body hit the ground, and in the chaos and gun smoke that followed, Thornton was seized by multiple men who tackled him to the earth, binding his hands with rope while he reportedly screamed for them to let him go, to allow him to finish what he had started. Jacob and Esther, hearing the gunshot and understanding immediately that their window of escape was measured in seconds, vanished into the darkness of the forest, and despite subsequent searches, they were never found or returned to bondage. Jebediah Thornton was transported to the county jail in Yanceyville on the morning of June 22, 1838, held in a small cell pending formal charges that would likely have included multiple counts of assisting fugitive slaves, theft of property, and conspiracy, crimes that carried severe penalties, including lengthy imprisonment or potentially execution, depending on the disposition of the court. However, on the morning of June 25th, just 3 days after his incarceration, the jailer discovered Thornton's body hanging from a beam in his cell, an apparent suicide accomplished using strips of fabric torn from his shirt, and the death was officially recorded as such in county records, despite persistent rumors that certain influential men had ensured Thornton would never have the opportunity to testify publicly about who might have assisted him or what networks existed to facilitate the escapes he had orchestrated. The German Shepherd's body was taken to Horace Dalton's plantation and buried in an unmarked grave near the property boundary, a disposal that seemed unremarkable until a letter written by Martha Cavanaugh to her sister in Charleston, discovered in 1982 among family papers held by descendants in South Carolina, revealed information that had been deliberately suppressed from official records. Cavanaugh wrote that authorities had searched Thornton's home thoroughly after his death and discovered hand-drawn maps showing routes northward through Virginia and into Pennsylvania, along with a leather-bound ledger that documented 14 names, dates, and destinations, a meticulous record of souls delivered to freedom, and that the dog's name, written on every single page in Thornton's careful script, was Hope. The letter stated explicitly that all evidence, the maps, the ledger, and related documents were buried with the animal to prevent their existence from inspiring similar acts of rebellion or providing information that might assist other fugitives. The ultimate fate of the 14 individuals whose freedom Thornton facilitated was never documented in any surviving records. Thornton's property was sold at auction in August 1838, his name systematically removed from church rolls and civic documents, and the grave remained unmarked and forgotten until 2011, when archaeological surveys rediscovered it, revealing skeletal remains of a large dog with a bullet still lodged in its skull.